Uh, I'm Bruce Nussbaum from Business Week, and I'm moderating this, perhaps what I consider one of the most important panels here. For those of us who've been in Davos for a couple of days and have gone to a couple of meetings and talked to people in the halls, China is on everyone's mind. In fact, one of the most important sub-themes of this whole Davos conference this year, I think, is China. If you want to talk about the dollar, you have to talk about China. If you want to talk about technology, you have to talk about China these days. If you want to talk about North Korea, you have to talk about China. If you want to talk about Japan, you have to talk about China. Global growth, China. U.S. growth, China. Every topic, every panel, we get to China. It is, I think, the most important theme of the conference in many ways. And we're very lucky to have a great many very distinguished people on the panel today. And I'd like to introduce you to them. All the way on the right, not politically speaking, Victor Chu, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, First Eastern Investment Group, Hong Kong SAR. Time to change the name, I think.
No way.
Okay. Okay. Carlos Ghosn, President, Nissan Motor Company, Japan. No introduction really necessary. Just a reminder, they're producing incredible cars. He turned around this company, a major investor in China. Dinesh Paliwal, Group Executive Vice President and Head of Automation Technologies Worldwide, ABB, a very big investor everywhere, including China, of course. To my right, U.S. Secretary of Commerce, of course, Donald Evans. Wonderful to have you here, sir.
Thank you, Bruce.
To my left, William Parrott, Chief Executive Officer, Deloitte Touche Tohmatsu. And to his left, Ulrich Schumacher, President and Chief Executive Officer, Infineon Technologies, chipmaker, Germany. Again, another big investor in China. We are going to talk about a number of topics. We're going to ask people whether they're making any money in China these days. We're going to ask people, what are the opportunities in China that we know of? What are the opportunities that we don't know of or that are unexpected? We're going to ask people, what are the key stumbling blocks that must be overcome to succeed in China? We're going to ask people about intellectual property and how you deal with that in China. We're going to ask people how you manage relationships in China, how you deal with bureaucracy, with politics, with Beijing, how you develop managers in China. We're going to ask a whole bunch of questions. But before we do that, we're going to ask the U.S. Commerce Secretary to get up and give us some remarks.
Bruce, thank you. I'm delighted to be back at this very enlightening forum and see so many friends that I saw a year ago. A lot of things have changed in the last year. Certainly remember coming here a year ago and a lot of concerns about what was going on around the world and a lot of concerns about America's position in the world and war on terrorism and steps we may or may not take. And you know, I'm glad to feel a little different reception this year than maybe felt a year ago. We're winning the war on terrorism, and we're going to continue to win it. China is just a remarkable story. I'm one that's very bullish, very optimistic on the future of China's integration in the global economy. I think it begins with just a recognition of how smoothly the fourth generation of leadership has moved into power in China. I have had the chance to meet with Premier Wen, President Hu, before he became president, but met with Premier Wen when I was there back in November. I think probably most people are kind of impressed at how smoothly the transition has gone and how quickly they have really captured the leadership and control of the country. So I'm one that believes that China is indeed headed in the right direction, and it is in good hands right now. I'd like to make mention of the fact to how the relationship between our two countries is very, very good. President Bush has visited China twice. He's the only president in the history of our country, history of America, to visit China twice. Secretary Powell's been there. I've been there a couple times. Secretary Snow has been there. Ambassador Zelik's been there. So the governments are doing what the government should be doing, and that is having active dialogue is how we can work together to strengthen not only the economic relationship between our two countries, but also do what we can to support China's integration into the global economy, which is taking place, and it's real, and it's going to continue to happen. There are a lot of very positive signs. As all of you know, they've enjoyed some 8% growth over the last 20 years. They have a remarkable savings rate in that country, a savings rate of about 40%. In fact, household savings in banks in China represent about 100% of GDP. That is remarkable when you think about it. There's 100% of household savings in banks representing this earnings or whatever, 1%, half a percent, that represents 100% of their GDP. Imports represent about 33% of the GDP. The productivity potential in that country is just, it's mind-boggling how much productivity potential they have. I was there in November. I went to the west, which is very important to do, is to go west. I saw hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland in the west. I didn't see a single tractor in the west. When you start thinking about kind of the gains they can make throughout that country in terms of productivity, it's remarkable. Has already been mentioned how trade is opened up in China. It's real. It's happening. It is really one of the driving forces of that dynamic economy. My visits, I must say, have been very inspiring. Having sat down with the leadership and their focus on what they need to do, and how their focus is internal, and focus is on what it is that they can do to get the conditions right for long-term economic growth in China. Foreign direct investment in China has been growing dramatically. It's about $500 billion now. But even having said that, only 8% of the capital formation in China this last year was a result of foreign direct investment. Pretty impressive. 92% of the capital formation in the country is coming from within China. So there are lots of encouraging signs. Certainly, they got a large reservoir of labor. Their labor pool is very, very large, and is a big asset for them, needless to say. And I would also say that the spirit of the people is one of they feel that their economy moving into a free market. They like it. I've had a chance to be on a couple of universities while I was there. When I was there in November, I spoke to the students in Xi'an Jiaotong University, and there was a crowd of about twice this size, maybe, I don't know what the number was, but about twice this size. And I was impressed that I was delivering my remarks to them about free market economies, about globalization, about their integration into the global economy, and not one of them required translation. I didn't see anybody with translation headsets on. Now, either they didn't want to hear what I had to say, which is a possibility, or they really are taken serious about, becoming a member of the global economy. Are there problems? Of course there are problems. There are challenges. We all know that. The banking system is not functioning like a banking system. Non-performing loans are just pick your number. It's 30, 40, 30, 40, 50% of the loans are non-performing. They're not functioning like a traditional commercial bank and able to price risk, which is very, very important in a free market economy, an entrepreneurial economy. You've got to be able to price risk, set interest rates according to your assessment of risk, which they can't do. I mean, the rates are set by the government, they're fixed. And so I think one of the real weaknesses in the economy right now is just the lack of pricing risks. Credit expansion has been pretty remarkable. I guess I worry some about just the allocation of resources, not necessarily allocating more resources, but the misallocation, or are you optimizing the allocation of resources in your country? Tremendous amount of lending going on to build the infrastructure of the country. And you see tunnels and bridges and roads and transportation and buildings going up everywhere. And who's going to pay for it? Who's going to service the debt? How is it going to be serviced when you build roads and tunnels and bridges and banks are funding that? Hey, who's going to pay it back? I mean, I think that's a question that has to be answered. IPR is a big issue. Bruce mentioned that. It's a huge issue because it just begins to send a signal. Are they going to be serious about enforcing their laws and serious about enforcing intellectual property right? About 95% of the DVDs and CDs are pirated or stolen, so it's something they got to do something about it. And the point I made while I was over there, how important it is to get this fixed, is after talking to those students at Jiaotong University, what about all these students? And they're all going to be innovators and entrepreneurs and contributing to the society and developing intellectual property themselves that they want to have protected. So it's in their own best interest that they make sure they're enforcing their intellectual property rights. Other areas that I'm concerned about are energy. Energy is going to be, the demand continues to grow. They're importing a lot more crude oil now than they were a couple of years ago. They're starting to have isolated brownouts and problems with it. So that's, again, just a big infrastructure issue that they've got to deal with to make sure that, because you can't grow. We've seen that here in America. You see it around the world. You cannot grow an economy without available, affordable, accessible energy. And so with this dramatic growth they've been experiencing, they've got to make sure that they get that right. Again, I do want to put a lot of emphasis on the fact that my view is they are focused internally. They are focused on dealing with the kind of problems within their country that is going to bring the 800 million people that are in the West up out of poverty and bring them into a growing economy, increasing their standard of living. When I went west, I went to one of the villages, and I saw two young blind brothers, and I visited with them, and I talked about their plight and some of the programs that American companies are sponsoring to help them, assist them. I gave this story to the premier when I saw him. And he came to the United States, and he used that story in every speech he made. But the point he wanted to use it was how important it was for all of us to remember the people in the West, because that's what they think about. The East is, it's Beijing, Shanghai, the coastline. I mean, it's booming in terms of the economy. But what about the people in the West? And so it just gave me the signal that they are certainly internally focused. I'm encouraged that with these free market principles, free market ideas, that they certainly have the notion that they need to move toward more freedom. They're connected, obviously. Open markets, free markets are connected to freedom. But that's going to be the big question. The big question is going to be, are they going to get more comfortable in letting market forces drive their economy? Are they going to continue to try and plan centrally and protect some of their own domestic industries? We see it beginning to see it some in the standard setting that's going on, that would discriminate against foreign companies coming into China, particularly in the telecommunications area, in the wireless area. There are standards that they're setting that are clearly designed to be advantageous to the China domestic companies. So, are they really going to open up and really try and harmonize their standards with the rest of the world, harmonize their customs with the rest of the world, and become a fully integrated member of the global economy, or they're not? I'm optimistic they will. I think the leadership will continue to do so, and know that governments, I feel, on both sides are doing what we're responsible for doing. And that is having very active, aggressive dialogues, constructive dialogues, dialogues in good spirit. We think trade is win-win. We don't think it's a zero-sum game. We think trade and opening up trade is a win-win kind of proposition. You being a part of the global economy is win-win, and we're committed to doing that. And we're committed, and they feel it, and they know we're committed. I'm going to have another meeting this spring with the JCCT, which is all part of this. So know that the governments are very engaged, I think more so than ever before. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to talk a little bit about the problems of working and dealing and working inside China, but I think the first question on a lot of people's minds, and I want to ask Carlos this question, is can you make any money in China?
Definitely, yes. Yes. That means, obviously, if you don't manage well your operation, you're not going to be making money in China, but you're not going to be making money nowhere. But in China, if you do the basics and you are really focused, you can be profitable. You can be even very profitable. I would like to mention that in the car industry, when you take a look at all the regions, probably today the most profitable market in the world is the US market, which is interesting because it's the most competitive, the most efficient, and the most profitable at the same time in the world. But China comes immediately after, which means the profitability you can make in China is higher than the one you can make in Japan, is higher than the one, by far higher than the one that you can make in Europe, and this is across the board. So yes, you can make money in China if you manage your operation appropriately.
This is kind of surprising to me. Can you be just a little bit more specific? How much money are you making in China?
Well, you know, in fact, for a car maker, you compare region by region with a very simple indicator. What's your operating margin? How much car you're selling is not very relevant. What's relevant is what's your operating margin. Today, for us, and we have checked it and we benchmarked it with many other competitors. You know, beside the United States or the North American market, I would say China comes second, which means not only is the highest growing market for the car industry, but at the same time, it's a very profitable market. That's why you're seeing all car manufacturers coming to China.
Mm-hmm. Dinesh, what's your experience there?
Well, I'll actually concur with Carlos. I think China has opportunities for most of the companies have gone in, but it depends very much what is your expectation to go to begin with. I mean, there's lots of companies have come in and they really created minefield for them by having unrealistic expectations and also not having the right relationship up front with the partners. So coming back to your real question of are we making money? In fact, we're profitable. We're very profitable, actually. We're quite happy. China ranks in top tier for us worldwide in profitability. And in fact, one of the recent survey which was conducted, I was reading about the Swedish Chamber of Commerce, they said 80% of the respondents said positively that they were profitable in China. And the 20% who were not making money, if you could look at their case study, you could find one or two fundamentals, as Carlos said. They had real flaws right from the beginning, how they approached the business in China.
Oh, it's interesting, very interesting. Victor, if they're making all this money in China, how do they get it out?
Well, it depends how you make the money. And if you are a portfolio investor, obviously, if you're able to invest into the X shares, the B shares, the red chips, then I think it's easy because there's no question about remittance. the investment were denominated in foreign currencies anyway. If you have been a direct investor, then I think you may already have built up a huge local currency mountain, RMB mountain, and you will need a very big internal treasury operation so that you can apply your RMB local currency earnings into further reinvestment. And you need to have good friends who might be able to
good friends in high places.
help you to utilize some of your excess pool of currency. But today, I want to add this because if I have a huge RMB mountain, I would be very slow in chaining them out because I think there's a market consensus that the RMB in the medium to long term is an appreciating currency. And if I were a US dollar denominated investor, yen or euro investor, the best time to go into China is now because China's currency is still fixed at 8.3 to the US dollars. Whereas if you invest in every other currency, you have the impact of the weakness of the dollar.
Victor, do you think the RMB, renminbi is going to be going up anytime soon? The next 12 months, the next 2 years? What's your view of that?
Put it this way, that's a $64 million question, of course.
Yeah.
But to us, I'm saying to our colleagues that we have a window of 9 months. So in the next 9 months, we want to really put substantial investment in yield-producing assets in China.
Wow, that's very interesting.
But obviously, if you talk to our Chinese government officials in Beijing, they will give you a very strong commitment that China is, on the one hand, it has committed to the US and the international community that will move towards a market-oriented mechanism. But on the other hand, stability in the currency is paramount. I think they really mean what they say. But the way that China works is once they have made up their mind, they can move very quickly. Mm-hmm. So I think in the next few months, they are evolving different options, different model. And once a model is agreed internally, which will take time, they will move very quickly. So I think we can look forward to some reconfiguration of the basket, not just pegging against the US dollar exclusively, but bring in other major trading currency that effectively is allowing the RMB to appreciate without upsetting a lot of other dynamics, or extending the ban. This is in the short to medium term. Obviously, in the longer term, anything is possible. So again, I urge all of our friends here, Chinese assets in 2004, I think will be good monkey business. Since today is the first day of the new year of monkey.
Oh, that's right. That's right. So buy those Shanghai apartments as soon as you can. Huh? Okay. I'd like to ask Ulrich about intellectual property and the issue of protecting it and Chinese efforts to deal with that and your own experience in investing there and what is that experience in terms of intellectual property?
Well, let me first comment a little bit also on money making. Also, we didn't find it so problematic to make money in China. No. I think the bad reputation, which partly has come across in the last 10 years, is more subject to wrong concepts rather than there is some inherent disadvantage of making money.
What do you mean wrong concepts?
Well, I'd say 7-8 years back, it was a little bit of sports to move big manufacturing sites into China because there was some kind of a political pressure also to do so. But if you build a semiconductor fab in China 7 years back, you can be astonished that it doesn't make money for 10 years because it was simply about the wrong timing. We, for example, in the last 8 years, were more trying to create partnerships, learn a little bit about the culture, about the way how business is done. And we think now the timing is right, not just because of the exchange rate. Now the timing is right to do big investments in China. We will move about 30% of our global investment into China in just the next 3 years.
30%?
30%, which is something like $1.2 billion, which we will invest in the next 3 years. We think the timing is right. But yes, you bring it back to the original question, which is IP protection. In this direction, China is both an opportunity and a challenge as well. There are more and more standards generated in China, which are domestic standards. which also has a little bit of a tendency to force people to move all resources into China. Today, we are already forced to have the full value chain in China. If, for example, we want to participate in the security and smart card programs, which we do, there is no alternative. And the question is really how open these standards will be to the world and whether there will be an alignment in the world. Another question in my industry, where IP is, well, I would say, a big part of your business, and especially the way, the chance to protect your IP. Up to now, we don't have a negative experience in China, but we have some experience in Taiwan, which is a different country. However, just recently, we had a little hiccup with a partner where, let's say, the legal position was clearly on our side, which was also found to be right in a European court. However, up to now, we have not really been able to enforce the protection of our rights in Taiwan. But let's say the other way around, our former partner is still running around using our technology, building our technology, and selling our technology. It's not transferable to China one-to-one, and I didn't want to give this impression. It's just say there are some things not yet solved, and it's not just the legislation, it's also the enforcement of the legislation, which is very important. Our concept today to avoid big issues is we move the most advanced technologies to China right now, where the innovation rate is very fast, so that if you have a problem of that, it innovates so fast that whatever you might lose there is nothing worse in 12 months from now, which is a little bit the other way around, which other people do. You move in very old technologies, which is a little bit of a risk, because there you have no way to innovate and to really get a learning curve. So we go the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Are you also moving R&D and things like that? Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes, because it's not just, maybe in the last 10 years, everyone was thinking about China mainly in its low cost. Yeah. But in the meantime, the technical skills are extraordinary. We are just building up a design center of 1,200 people in Xi'an, which is on the western part of China, because it's a combination of technical skills, the ability to work in 3 shifts and 12 hours and 7 days, which makes whatever you do in the Western country, you can develop twice as fast in China, not just cheaper. And the speed and time to market in my industry is very important. And even if you now really would move, and this is a hard job in Germany, move into 3 shifts, it's pretty unlikely that you can make engineering work, for example, on Saturday and Sunday. So there is not just a cost advantage.
Engineers don't work on Saturday and Sunday in Germany?
Well, in the fab, you found arguments, and you had all the negotiations with the Pope and all whoever is involved in that. But in engineering, it's still a big question mark. And that has changed very fast. 5 years back, I would have said we keep Germany for development, innovation, and this is a concept for the future. Today, I have already hard times to justify investment into R&D in Germany, because I can also do it already right now more efficient in China.
Wow.
And that increased the problem of IP protection, of course. Because if 1,200 engineers, which is basically our know-how and IP is mainly also in their heads, if they decide to move one door ahead, you might have an issue.
Wow. One quick question on IP, back to Carlos. Are they knocking off any of your cars or trucks in China? Copying them?
We have problems for preserving our intellectual property. It's definitely a challenge. You know, one of the topics we're talking about is it a gold mine or a minefield? Yeah. I mean, if you want to characterize a minefield, without any doubt, protection of intellectual property is one of the elements of the minefield. And I think, in a certain way, transforming China into a really developed country means that at a certain point in time, people, who are investing in China have to feel more secure about their intellectual property, which is not the case today. We are, suing and pursuing, and we're not the only car manufacturer doing this, because our designs are being copied, internal design, external design, even brand names, logos, etc. And even though today, expectation to be successful, even in the most obvious case, is low, we continue to do it because in a certain way it's helping China to face this issue and not just be mute about it because we think that we're not going to get anything. I think it's part of our responsibility as foreign investor to stand up and say this is not acceptable, even if we think that the probability of prevailing is low today.
Can I ask I guess it'd be a fairly blunt question. Is the problem, the IP problem, mostly with your partners, or is it with other manufacturers? That is, you have to partner in China, as you're saying, to be successful and profitable there. But does that also give rise to the problem of your partners then copying your products?
In our case, it's not our partners.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ulrich, is that a...
Again, it wasn't China, it was Taiwan, but
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
our partner, basically.
Yeah.
In our case, it's a very complicated technology, so you have to be very close to start a copy. It's just not that you can walk by and like, hey, I look at this nice design. So up to now, it's the partners where we have to be careful.
Okay. Well, perhaps we could talk a little bit about the management of partnership in China, since it's very clear that to be successful in China, you're going to have to partner up and take on local partners, and in a very intimate way, in a very involved way, not a very distant way. William, do you have some thoughts about how you manage that relationship, what you should do, what you shouldn't do?
Sure. I think for our firm, a professional service firm, the way we would grow in a country like China, very much the way we became the #1 firm in Japan, is through amalgamation of local firms. We believe that having a real understanding of the local community, the local economic system, the local environment is key to the consulting work we do, also to the auditing work we do. So we try to grow by bringing people into our firm locally. Also, we have a big exchange program for our people where we'll take people from China, move them to other parts of the world for training purposes, and also in reverse. To give you an example, we have about 144 Mandarin-speaking individuals just in our New York office. And many of them have a desire to go on a temporary basis to China to work, and some of them on a permanent basis to China to work. And so we have quite an extensive program to facilitate that. And then we do a lot with the education of the individuals, both sending them to advanced development courses, MBA courses outside of China. And then I think our experience also is that really trying to use the same principles in China that we use in other parts of the world in terms of trying to be an employer of choice in China, whether it be the benefits that we give, whether it be the compensation we give, whether it be just the way we treat people in China as well. So that's our perspective there.
Okay. I'd like to ask Commerce Secretary, what we're hearing here is that China is not only becoming a manufacturing center for the world, it's also getting really good at engineering, at R&D, at all the things that the U.S. is very good at and supposed to be its competitive edge. How do you think the U.S. should be responding to this?
Well, Bruce, I think we ought to continuing to be encouraging this. I think China becoming a more competitive and innovative country is good for the global economy. I think we ought to be encouraging the kinds of create the conditions in the China economy for long-term economic growth, and innovation is a very big part of that. Innovation leads to higher productivity, that leads to economic growth, that leads to higher standard of living. It seems to me that's what we want to see happen in China. That leads to more freedoms, more higher quality of life. So I think the response in the U.S. ought to be to continue to encourage that and help foster that. There are 60,000 Chinese students in America. They're here, they're not here, they're in America, learning more about the American system. Many of them will go back home to China and take some of these skills with them. And on top of that, we're all seeing the development of the education system in China. It's going to become stronger and stronger and stronger, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think, our responsibility as Americans, anyway, is to encourage other countries around the world to create the conditions for long-term economic growth. That's healthy for the world. That's healthy to leading this world to a place of peace and prosperity and freedom and lifting people up out of poverty. And so I'm not one that sits here being all concerned about, golly, are we, there's too much of the higher end value stuff is all of a sudden beginning to move to China. I mean, we can't try and micromanage that. What we can try and do is share with the rest of the world, including China, what kind of conditions help or the right conditions for long-term economic growth in your country. So I'm not concerned about it. I'm optimistic about it. I think it means that China will have a better chance of lifting these 800 million people that they have living in poverty up out of poverty in the West. So it's something that we'll continue to encourage. And you asked the other panelists about businesses in China. I can tell you that the businesses, my perception, talking to businesses that are over there, they are optimistic and they're making money. I know most economists that I talk in terms of kind of 14% pre-tax rate of return, broadly speaking, across the economy. Pretty healthy kind of pre-tax return. So, that side of the economy does look well.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, it is good.
Victor, let me ask you, now that we're back to talking about money, how do you manage the bureaucratic and political relationships in China if you're a businessman? I mean, there are a lot of layers, and they're not all very formal. There's some that are formal, some that are informal. You have local representatives, you have Communist Party representatives, you have people in Beijing. You have a court system that sometimes works and doesn't work. I mean, how do you make all that work for you if you're a businessman in China, foreign businessman in China?
I think China is not unique. I mean, this is a challenge that we encounter in most emerging markets. I mean, like going into a horse race, everybody thinks that they have the hot tip. Otherwise, you won't be going into horse racing, right? In China, everybody believes that they have good, what we call guanxi, good relationship. But as you said, Bruce, there are many layers of a relationship. I have been investing in China now for 15 years, and I come to a very clear conclusion, and that is you can't succeed in China without good relationship. But if that's all you have, that's not sufficient either. So you need good relationship because everybody else have good relationship. So in a way, you cancel each other out, right? And you need to use the right relationship at the right time, plus your skill, your experience, your commitment, your capital, your technology. I think you need a total commitment. But I would not go into a competitive environment like China today without very, very in-depth study of your own industry dynamics, like we do in elsewhere of the world. But you also have to be truthful, be loyal to your partner, your allies, and make sure we succeed together. And one point I just want to pick up just now is that the technological development in China, a lot of it is contributed by multinationals, people around the table. So it's not us versus China. It's a win-win formula, like Mr. Evans has mentioned. So that's very exciting. But I think in terms of troubleshooting, that is an issue which I still have a lot of reservation. I think two of the most challenging areas, one is to develop your own homegrown team, your HR. It's taken us more than 10 years to get our home team right, to develop the right culture, instill the right loyalty, comfort, standards. But if you have a problem in China, we have to recognize that it's a different ballgame there. The legal process, which we are familiar with, is only one of several channels that one can access to. And it may not be, in your case, the most efficient channel. You need to go to the law to assert your right, but the legal justice system is not efficient in China. And the quality of dispute resolution varies from place to place. And they're not expert commercial courts that can help you to resolve very complex transactions, disputes in complex transactions. So you need to use your personal relationship. You need to use your political relationship. Talk to Mr. Evans and his colleagues at the American Embassy in Washington if you have a problem. Talk to government officials. they might be able to, on an administrative basis, help you to expedite your resolution. So I think one needs to use a cocktail of channels to deliver a quick dispute resolution remedy. So I think we just have to recognize that China is still quite different. It is improving every day, but I think in the meantime, we just have to give it the best that we have.
Yes. And again, you're basically emphasizing get a good partner or a series of partners whom you can trust and who really know how to operate in that environment. I'd like to open this up to the audience now. We have some time, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions. There are a couple of microphones. I'm sorry, the light's right in my eyes, so I don't know where the microphones are. But I'm going to start pointing to some folks, and why don't we start over here, and we'll move around. Everyone's going to get a chance.
Thank you very much. Guy de Jonquière, the Financial Times. If I make two questions, one for the business members of the panel. There is growing concern, both among economists who follow China and apparently among the Chinese authorities, at the signs of incipient overheating, which brings with it concerns that of rising inflation and higher interest rates, which could have a serious impact on China's growth. How large a concern is that for you? And a question for Secretary Evans. You described the US-China relationship as being very, very good. How important is it for it to remain this good that China allow an appreciation of the renminbi, and how big an appreciation would you like to see?
That's three questions. Let's take the first one. We have a volunteer. Overheating in China. People are talking about it in the hallways. It's really an issue. I think they had 9 to 10% growth in the last quarter. Dinesh?
Yeah. We've been hearing about overheating in China for the last so many years. And we have also talked about, is it really growing 8%, 7, or 15? I mean, there are all kinds of numbers being thrown around. We have to remember that we're coming out of deflation environment in China. For past so many years, we had a different issue. And now we are starting to come and see 2, 3, 3%, depending on which region, urban versus poor provinces you're looking at. So at the moment, from the business point of view, we don't see that from the inflationary forces if they are threatening the businesses. Number two, from the consumption point of view, I speak for my company's behalf. I mean, we have made an attempt to set up some large factories with the intention to export out of China. And to our surprise, by the time you get ready to start manufacturing, it's all being consumed right there. So that's being consumed. Now, as Secretary Evans said, go west is a conscious effort and forces coming from Chinese side that we as a business community being encouraged that not just the Guangzhou and Shanghai and Wuhan and Tianjin go west. So we're going now into west, and that is actually bringing multiple forces, living standards being improved, infrastructure as it is developing. That's consuming a lot of that. So if that wasn't the case uniformly, then we would have some concern overheating. So from our point of view, as we see growing double-digit for last several years, watching very carefully how the inflation is developing, watching very carefully how the capital market is developing, and what are the real threats. We don't see, from our point of view, and we have tripled our volume in China in the last 10 years. And I lived myself running the business for ABB for several years there, and these issues were there in 1992, 93, 94 times. So they're still there, and I think they're being very well managed.
Secretary Evans?
Yeah. Let me, and one other comment on what Dinesh said, and that is, you know, what's really important is to have good data and good information. He just mentioned, 7% growth, 8% growth, 15% growth. What is it? Nobody seems to really know. What are the non-performing loans in the bank? Are they 30%, 40%, 50%? And you have to have good information in order to assess kind of the state of the economy. And so we continue to put a lot of emphasis on the importance when we talk to our Chinese counterparts. Importance of good, transparent information so people can assess kind of the state of the economy. With respect to currency, I learned a long time ago, I don't speak about the currency. That's not my job. That belongs to the President of the United States and the Secretary of Treasury. But I will say this. What we're simply trying to do around the world is encourage other countries to create the conditions for long-term economic growth. The fiscal policies, the monetary policies, the regulatory policies that have worked in America and have worked in our system and made it the most powerful economic engine in the world today. And so when we travel the world, what we say to others is get fiscal policies right and monetary policies right and regulatory policies right and for create the conditions for long-term economic growth. That's the key. That's what you have to be focused on in this country. With respect to the exchange rate, the only comment I will make is that be mindful that there are restricted capital flows in China today. I made the comment earlier that household saving in China represents 100% of GDP. Sitting in savings accounts across the economy, commercial banks earning some 0.5%. If all of a sudden that capital is allowed to flow freely to some other place, what are the households going to do with this capital? Are they going to leave it right there in China, or are they going to take that as an opportunity to maybe invest someplace else in some other part of the world?
And what will that mean for the currency, for the RMB?
Yeah.
Exactly. So
I don't
be
know
careful with what you ask for.
I don't know the answer to the question. I'm not suggesting that I do, but I just point out that you've got to kind of think all the way through it, and nobody knows the answer. But we have. I mean, the president has made it clear that he's certainly encouraging them to continue to move toward a more flexible exchange rate, which they have suggested that's their intention, to move toward a more flexible exchange rate.
Good. Questions, sir? We need a mic here. Here comes the mic.
I'm Shekhar Bajaj from India. Two things which have happened in the last 5 to 6 years. There's been continuous deflation, especially in case of consumer durables. The prices have been continuously going down. But only since October, November, because of the raw material prices that have gone up, the prices have started to move up. After almost 5-6 years, I've continuously seen this been going down. Second, from 1st of January, they have reduced the subsidy from 17% to 13%. With this, the margins are being squeezed. And therefore, Mr. Chu, would you think that the profitability, these three players have said the profits are up, but in consumer durables, with the cutthroat competition, are the profits going to be eroded completely?
I think that will really depend on how competitive a particular player is. I think in my own group and from what I know, China can become very competitive. Even with in the context of deflation. And I think one thing China is very aware is that it is not the only emerging market. There are other emerging markets around the world, all offering very competitive and very favorable environment. So China needs to look over its shoulder all the time to be competitive, to be engaging, so that one can incorporate some of these factors into their advantage. For example, one way the Chinese manufacturers could become more competitive is to bring some of the ASEAN outsourcing supply chain value added into the equation in China. Right? So everybody is thinking about how to do it better. And certainly in the service sector, we're not seeing that problem yet. I think the service sector, the price are still, the margins are still very good, very favorable, because there's so much demand for services.
Interesting. I I can't remember who on the panel mentioned this to me earlier as we were setting up, but someone said that the price paid for engineering, Dinesh, it was you, in China has been rising rather significantly, and today what you have to pay for a good engineering job in Shanghai is pretty much what you'd have to pay in Czechoslovakia. So this concept about China being low cost and da-da-da, you have to look at China as a dynamic, changing society where prices and costs are also moving and changing, and the Chinese themselves will have to deal with this. But as Americans or Europeans and others begin to invest in China, have to be aware that the cost advantages may be changing over time.
At one point, we talk about the unit cost of labor in China being half of Thailand, and certainly 1/3 of Malaysia. That sometimes is a red herring because we're talking about the average cost of China as a whole. But if your plant is in Shanghai or Beijing in the coastal area, it's substantially higher than that. So one way of getting cost advantage is to move inland and move west and bring down your unit cost of production. Yeah.
But can you find really good engineers in the West, or are they all coming out of schools in Shanghai and staying there and that sort of thing? Ulrich?
The reason why we are going to Xi'an is exactly that in Shanghai and Beijing today, it wouldn't make sense long term to build up an engineering center because you can count that in 5 years there's no major difference. However, in the not yet developed part of China, I think you can enjoy that for at least another decade. And at the end of the day, as soon as engineering gets much better and the company gets higher, at the end of the day, you don't care if it really raises and the quality of the engineering is good. So I'm not concerned about that at all. And don't forget, this is a country which is, everybody in this country is eager to learn. It's part of their culture. It's fascinating how our employees, how fast they are, how fast they want to adapt innovation, how fast they want to move innovation, which is a complete contradiction to our environment. So at the end of the day, especially in our sector, engineering is not just driven by cost and competence. Also, if you are in an innovation-friendly environment, you just have much better results as if you wouldn't be in a country where everybody is fighting against any kind of innovation. And all this is really counting into the right direction.
An innovation-friendly environment, I like that. Yes.
Just maybe a little bit contrarian opinion. I mean, salary is not relevant. Frankly, it's not relevant. Because you can be, and you've been in China in a situation where you have low salary and high cost. It's cost which is relevant. It's not so much salary.
How does that work?
Let me tell you how it works. That means today you don't see a lot of export of cars from China to other markets.
Yeah.
You wonder why. Because we say, well, it's a cheap labor, it's available, you can find all the people you want. For a very simple reason is today the cost of the same car produced in China and in Japan, well, Japan is cheaper than China, even though the salary in Japan is 20 times the salary in China. So you have a situation in which in one country you have low salary, high cost, and in another country you have high salary, low cost. And what you want to transform and what you want to manage in China is a situation where, on the contrary, you can have people who are loyal to your company, gaining enough money to have a good living, at the same time allowing you to work onto the efficiency of your company and establish a good business system. So, focusing on salary, in my opinion, is the wrong direction. You have to focus in how to make your cost much lower. And from time to time, having lower cost means giving higher salaries, making sure that you're training people, you are keeping them inside your company. Because one important element that we didn't mention so far, we mentioned about some of the traps of China, because there are some very important strengths in China. And probably the most important one is that China is a learning society. Chinese are very eager to learn. I mean, this is one of the most impressive things about China. We have a partner which has been a company for a long time in China, and we are impressed by not only how much they are eager to learn on the technology side, but how much they are eager to learn on management side, how much they want to learn about a good communication, how do you manage your finance. They are like a sponge at all the levels. They are eager to learn. And I think this is the most important strength today existing in the Chinese market.
Yeah, that's fascinating. questions. Yeah. Oh, wait.
Bruce, of course, every sector is different as well. So, for example, in the professional service sector, our costs are very comparable with some of the developed markets around the world, because the companies that are either going public from China or the companies that are investing in China are looking for top-notch expertise. And so we have to pay at the level, both in terms of the Chinese individuals and also people that we bring into the country as well. So we don't really enjoy any type of a cost advantage from a salary standpoint in that country.
Okay. Sir, promised I'd call on you.
Thank you. My name is Thierry de Montbrial from France. I have two questions. First, you gave an extremely positive vision of China, and I think it's well taken. However, there are still some huge structural problems to be resolved, huge structural adjustment for conglomerates and so forth and so on, and therefore very huge social problems that were not mentioned at all so far. And it seems to me that sooner or later there will be a downturn, maybe because of overheating, maybe for some other reasons, but there is no example in economic history of economic growth without cycles. I mean, and when the day comes, I don't know if it is next year, in 5 years' time, or later, but when the day comes, the social tensions will create an enormous political problem inside China, and this, of course, has to do with the democratic process. So my first question is, it seems to me that so far in the discussion there has been no allusion at all to this social-political relationship, and in my judgment that could be in the future a source of problem. And my second question will be shorter. There was no allusion at all so far on external problems, and of course I'm thinking of Taiwan. The Taiwan Chinese, mainland China, Taiwan situation is far from resolved, and nobody can be sure that there would not be a very serious crisis in the years to come. And if there is one point, and only one, that could be a source of a war, I think it's the Taiwan issue.
And I think, if I may just rephrase it, the real issue here is we know there will be an economic downturn sometime, unless economic history is being rewritten right now. And the question is whether China has the political system, political flexibility to deal with it, and on a more immediate sense, does it have a financial system that can deal with that? And I'm looking over at you, Victor, but I don't really have to, but I will look out at you anyhow. Why don't you, take a crack at that?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that.
Yeah.
I think actually Secretary Evans, in his initial remarks, actually focused in some of the questions you raised, that the Chinese leadership now are very, very focused in trying to resolve domestic challenges. And there's no doubt about it, domestic challenges are huge. Because China is still politically a totalitarian system. There's no automatic, peaceful process for the transition of power. So if the people are not happy, and the social tension gets to a boiling point, we will have a problem in succession, right? So I think that's something that one needs to watch. But we have a very, very good team at the top, and they're very serious in promoting social harmony. One of the problems of overheating in the coastal region is not just economic, it's really social, because the gap between the have and have-nots are widening. But Beijing, I think, is very well aware of that. The major challenge are unemployment, because in order to reform the state-owned enterprise, you have to let people go, right? And how do you develop a social security safety net which can take care of that dynamic? There's also issue of people immigrating from the rural areas into the urban areas. In the next 10 years, China target to move over 300 million people. So you have infrastructural, environmental, educational, healthcare, every challenge that we think about, China will be times 100 times. So these are really serious issues. So I think you're right in bringing out this. In looking at the attraction of China, we have to bear in mind that there are risks. But we hope that the Chinese leadership in Beijing is well-versed enough and dynamic enough to manage these. And your point about cross-strait relations, again, is very real. I mean, in the past, the conventional wisdom is, despite all the rhetorics, at the end of the day, people's sense prevail. But this time, I think one needs to assess the risks again, because the president in Taiwan is pushing his card very aggressively.
Yes, indeed. Secretary?
Yeah, I just agree with everything Victor just said, and I tried to make my comments earlier about how impressed I am with how internally China is focused, and how much they understand the big social concerns of their country right now. Why they have this such large focus on the West, and the big disparity, as Victor alluded to, between the haves and the have-nots that are emerging in that country. So I don't think you've got leadership that is, I mean, they're not going to be blindsided by it. They're aware of it, and very dedicated to managing their way through this issue as they've gone through the privatization of that economy. They've lost 50 million jobs, 50 million. Now, what are they going to do to take care of these 50 million people that now all of a sudden are looking for a job? And what kind of safety net are they going to have to provide? And so you're talking about leadership in a country that is not thinking outside its borders today. It's thinking about itself internally and how they're going to manage their way through this. And in terms of political transition, one, I've tried to make the point of how impressed, I think the world has been, and how smoothly the transition has gone from Jiang Zemin to President Hu and Premier Wen. And how quickly they've responded to some of the SARS issue. Certainly their ability to deal with that very quickly. They're showing great leadership, but you're also seeing the country begin to experiment down at the city level and the town level with some pure democratic elections. In some of these cities, some of the towns, starting to hold democratic elections to try and bring that process into their political system. So, it's just the leadership and their commitment to it, and knowing that America certainly is more engaged with them, more dialogue, more consultation, more support than ever before, is what gives me the encouragement that they'll be able to make it through downturns that they will inevitably have. That it's going to happen. I mean, nobody knows exactly when or how deep or how large it will be, but it happens in any kind of free market economy. And I'm one that believes that that they're developing the conditions so that they'll be able to manage their way through it.
Exactly. Actually, on the Taiwan issue, as I recall, not so many months ago, the Bush administration actually cautioned Taiwan on going too far, which was a very important signal, particularly from a Republican administration to Taiwan. Ulrich, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just two fast remarks. I had the opportunity to visit China with a delegation of the Chancellor, which gave us access to a high-ranking politician across the board. And exactly as mentioned, everybody is aware of the structural issue. Everybody is sending you to the West. So I would love to have such kind of an awareness of structural issues ahead in my country than we have seen in China. So I don't say there isn't an issue, but they tackle with this. Regarding the downturn, we should not forget one thing. My industry has seen the worst crisis in 50 years history in the last 3 years. Yeah. Unfortunately, China was still growing. Yeah. In the meantime, they export 50% of the phones they build. So they're just on the way to serve the market. So, yes, there might be a crisis. But if we have a crisis in China, I'm not sure what we have here. There is not any argument why we could assume that there will be an industrial crisis in China and the rest of the world is booming. Yeah. So I'm not trying to play that down, but we should put things into perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think they tackle their issues. Sometimes they need a little bit pressure and advice to really get in the right direction, for example, at the range of IP. But I'm not so concerned about these worst-case scenario you mentioned before.
Okay, a couple more questions. Over here.
My name's Deborah Haynes from AFP. Secretary Evans, you said that that you thought China was very interested about learning from the West and from the outside world. I'm just interested to know why there's no one actually from the Chinese government or from Chinese industry on the panel.
Or at Davos, you mean?
On the panel here, talking about this subject.
I didn't put the panel together, so.
I'll speak for Secretary Evans, since I think he's innocent here. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the schedule, there are very few officials from the Chinese government at Davos. I'm not exactly sure what the reason is. It's Chinese New Year, or there may be other reasons. But that's the reason why they're not on the panel. Short answer. Maybe next year they'll be here.
Bruce,
What?
I can share a little bit of information here because I'm quite involved in trying to invite senior Chinese officials to come here. I think the main reason is the timing, because this time we hit right in the middle of Chinese New Year. And if you understand the traditions in China, Chinese leaders, even though they are top leaders, they have a lot of obligations during the Spring Festival. They have to go and visit many retired leaders, and there are also a lot of strategic discussions that goes on during the Spring Festival holidays. But I think the Chinese government, I think I can also share, has already expressed to the forum that they would double up their efforts to send the right level of representation to Davos and our other regional meetings in the future.
Maybe we should have a Davos in Shanghai sometime.
Bruce, the next regional meeting for Asia is actually going to be in China for the forum, and that's in the middle of next year.
Okay. Questions? You.
My name is Xinghai Fang. I'm from the Shanghai Stock Exchange. I have a short comment and then one question. The comment is that there has been a lot of interest on whether the Chinese economy is overheating or not. And I just want to give you a very short answer. I think the answer is no. And the reason is that you look at three indicators of whether an economy is overheating or not. Overheating applies to a situation where the domestic resources are not enough to support the kind of level of economic activity that's going on. And in China, if you look at the domestic situation, for example, labor market, there's a huge amount of surplus labor there. New college graduates, for example, only 50% or so can find jobs right away, and the other 50% have to wait. So there's a lot of surplus there. And on the external side, China still enjoys a short current account surplus, not a current account deficit. And an overheating economy usually has a current account deficit. And then if you look at the overall economic situation, the overall picture, inflation rate is only about 2% right now. And a few years ago, it was like negative, right? So if you look at such an economy, you cannot conclude that it is overheating. You cannot only look at the growth rate, which is 9.1% last year, and say, hey, this is overheating because 9.1% is unheard of in anywhere else or other parts of the world. And I think for an economy like China, which has a per capita GDP of only $1,000 at this point, it can grow at 12% or 15% for 10 more years without any worry about overheating. So much for the comment. And the question is that, the question actually is to some of the business executives sitting there. A lot of people go to China to invest because China is a big market, labor cost is low, and so forth, political stability and so forth. But I want to point out another unutilized sort of resources or advantages that China has that a lot of foreign executives may think about. Secretary Evans pointed out that China has a household deposit in the banking system that is equivalent or even more than 100% of the GDP. And this is a huge amount of domestic equity financing sources that you can employ. For someone from the Shanghai Stock Exchange, I would love to see some of the foreign companies that have operations in China to have a listing in the stock exchange. And by doing that, you can avail of yourself a very cheap amount of large quantity amount of labor, of savings. For example, for Mr. Ghosn's company, you can trade at a PE of more than 30 in the Shanghai Stock Exchange. And I'm sure if you're trading in New York, it's only 10 or 15
How about
PE. So I'm just wondering whether these executives have thought about that advantage that China has that they may use.
Well, we have,
Yeah, right. Right.
or from the Shanghai Stock Exchange, which itself may be overheating. We don't know.
Next question.
It's a legitimate question in terms of listing on the. Has anyone thought of listing on the?
Well, it's simply true that there are much higher multiples around there than there are in our regions. We haven't, it's a bit complicated. So I wouldn't say we haven't thought about it. Up to now, we didn't find it feasible. But we enjoy partnership with companies who have a 5 times higher multiple than we have on our own.
Yeah.
So I think the argument is fair.
Yeah, argument is fair. Okay.
And sorry to say, another remark. It's by far easier to get money in China from the same banks which will not give you any money in Europe. So
is that right?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes.
We're learning an awful lot here today. I get back there.
When I look at China today, it resembles Japan from the late 80s and the early 90s from one perspective. In the early 90s, the Japanese currency appreciated, and a lot of so-called Japanese competitiveness went with it. A lot of companies found that they were competitive in a mispriced currency regime, but in a real currency regime, they were not competitive. Do you see similar fears happening out of China as the Chinese currency appreciates?
Who wants to answer that? Looking here.
I can
brave
take a shot
man.
at it.
Okay.
Yeah, I can take a shot at it. First, you can't say today that China is competitive on everything. It's not true. I mean, I take the car industry. You can't export cars from China today. You can't. It's not competitive. I mean, it has the potential to be competitive 5, 10 years down the road. But today, exporting cars from China, I say, you are in a situation where you have a low salary, high cost. And this is something which is not sustainable. So there is still more development to come. The second point is, when you make the comparison to Japan, there are a lot of things that we need to understand coming from outside China to try to understand why we're having this situation and where we're going to go from there. Without talking about the macroeconomy, let's talk about very specific things. Some of the major Chinese companies, for example, let's talk basic management, you have one vice president in any large company who is at the same time secretary of the Communist Party, head of the union, and head of human resources. And this is an existing function. So obviously, when you're coming from outside China and you're managing big corporation, you're going to say, okay, how do you handle that? I mean, what kind of responsibility, what's the added value? How do you transit from a situation where you have one person who is the head of HR, very important function into a company, and at the same time representing the union? Already there is a lot of country where you have the head of the union who is at the same time the head of HR, and a third of this, secretary of the Communist Party. How do you transit from here? So I'm not saying this is right or wrong. When you come from outside, you have to understand why it's different and what's strong, what's positive in it, and make sure that the only thing you change it only for the sake of performance of the company and not for anything else. So I would not make a big parallel with Japan, at least from the management point of view.
You're suggesting when you have that one person that it's very efficient to have one person have all 3 jobs like that?
This would be the positive side of it.
It's really good. I think we have time for one more question, sir. Here comes the mic.
I'm Kitashiro, Keizai Doyukai in Japan, and a lot of economists say that Chinese economy will continue to grow until year 2008 or 2010. But due to the issues of energy, water supply, food supply, and environment issues, there may be the risks of the continuous growth of the China. And what are the business community are taking as a risk management of the crisis that may come in the future? Are you continue to just invest in China or have some measures to protect your investment in China?
Maybe I'll start. Most of the companies that I'm aware of have a very bright view of China, certainly over the next decade, over the next 15 years. A couple of companies have done scenario planning around the GDP, and the projection would be almost on a worst-case basis, a 6% GDP over the next 10 years. But I also think the companies are also building into their plans, to the extent possible, a scenario to comprehend the various risks that are out there, the risks of shortage of commodities, the risk of stability in the government, a lack of stability in the government as well. But I think right now, at least the 10-year horizon for most of the companies, 15-year horizon is very, very positive. So they're probably underplaying the risk side because of the very, very positive outlook in the near term.
The opportunities. Well, I think we have to call an end to this, I'm afraid. I've had a lot of fun and learned an awful lot, and I want to thank you all for being here, and thank the panel very much.